My parents didn't just favor my sister. They tried to erase me. The day my grandfather died, I found out they were quietly planning to give my inheritance, the last thing he ever left for me, straight to their golden daughter. They truly believed I wouldn't fight back. But what they never expected was the twist my grandparents had prepared long before I even knew I needed saving. And when the truth finally cracked open, it didn't just expose them, it exposed everything I had survived growing up in that house. Before I share my story, I want to know you are here with me. Just say, listening in the comments, or let me know where you are. Sometimes even the smallest connection makes a story feel heard. Thank you. And now, here's my story. My name is Riven Calder. If you want to follow the rest of this journey with me, please consider subscribing. It means more than you know, especially for someone who grew up believing his voice never mattered. When the call came in, I was sitting alone in my small Portland apartment staring at a half-cold cup of coffee. My grandfather Thomas Calder was gone. Just like that. 30 years old, and somehow the news hit a part of me I thought I'd buried for good. The grief was real heavy, but it came tangled with something else, a quiet dread rising from the same place every childhood memory lived. Going back to Redwood County meant returning to the life I'd tried to outrun. Some families treat love like a resource that needs to be rationed. I grew up in a family like that. As I threw clothes into a bag, the scenes of my childhood slid in without warning. That old cabin tucked between towering redwoods, the smell of damp earth after every winter rain, and those long dinners where everyone seemed to orbit around Savannah. My little sister, the center of every conversation, every plan, every reason my parents smiled. I wasn't mistreated. I was simply unseen. Over time, that emptiness becomes its own kind of wound. I remembered being 6, watching my parents set up a massive birthday party for Savannah at Redwood Park. Face painters, balloons tied to every branch, neighbors invited, folding tables covered in pastel cupcakes. She was 3, and me. My birthday that same year was a store-bought cake placed on the scratched kitchen table. No guests, no fuss. Even at that age, something inside me recognized the imbalance long before I knew how to name it. But my grandfather, he saw me. Even then, his eyes always held something my parents didn't: patience, recognition, a quiet steadiness that made me feel like I wasn't as invisible as the world insisted I was. He once crouched beside me during a family barbecue, put a hand on my shoulder and said, "Not everyone who brings you into this world knows how to see you, but I see you, Riven." He had been my one anchor in a home where everything tilted toward Savannah. And years later, during a trip to Denver, he told me something I didn't understand back then. "One day you'll know why I kept every certificate, every little thing you achieved." It sounded like a riddle, a promise half buried under his gentle voice. Now with him gone, those words returned like a whisper curling around the back of my mind. What had he been preparing me for? What had he seen coming? As I locked my apartment and headed for the airport, the grief deepened, but beneath it pulsed an unease I couldn't shake. It felt like my grandfather's death wasn't the end of something, it was the opening of a door he'd been waiting for me to walk through. And on the other side of it, I sensed a truth large enough to change everything I thought I knew about my family. I boarded the plane to Denver with one certainty: my grandfather still had something left to tell me. The moment I stepped into my grandparents' old house in Denver, the familiar scent of pine wood and engine oil wrapped around me. My grandfather used to fix his truck right out back, and the smell somehow never left the walls. It should have been comforting, but instead it pierced straight through the years and reminded me how much this place once filled the spaces my parents never bothered to. I wandered through the living room and memories unfolded like someone pulling old film reels from a shelf. Every scene different, but the theme always the same. I won first place at the regional science fair. They missed it because Savannah had a stomachache. Savannah got a B+, they took her to Applebee's to celebrate her growth. I spent a month rehearsing for a school play. They walked in an hour late, whispering excuses about traffic. I saved all summer to buy a used bike. Savannah said she liked it, and the next day my parents bought her a brand new one worth 3 times as much. Individually, those moments felt like tiny scratches. Together, they were a map of what my childhood really was, a long hallway of closed doors. While sorting through old boxes in the living room, I found something that stopped me cold: my grandmother Eleanor's notebook. Worn edges, faded ink, but each page razor sharp in its intentions. She had documented everything. Dates, events, every moment my parents chose Savannah over me. Mark refused to attend Riven's play. Parent-teacher conference for Savannah, both parents present. For Riven, absence excused, too tired. And right in the middle of the notebook, written in her neat cursive, "If I don't write this down, no one will believe Riven." I sat down hard on the couch, the air leaving my lungs. She hadn't just noticed. She had protected me in the only way she could by recording a truth the rest of the family was determined to ignore. And then, buried beneath some old insurance papers, I found a letter she'd written to my father, never mailed. A warning. She told him my grandfather would not rewrite the will to favor Savannah, no matter how much pressure he applied. And at the end, one line chilled me. "You are going too far, Mark. Thomas will not let this happen." That sentence alone revealed what I'd never dared imagine. My grandparents had been fighting a quiet battle for me, long before I even knew there was a war. Sitting in that silent house, holding that letter, I realized I'd stepped into the first layer of a truth much bigger than old childhood wounds. Something had been brewing in my family for decades, and my grandfather's death had just pulled the lid off. And deep down, I knew this was only the beginning. Leaving Redwood County for Portland felt like walking out of a fog I didn't know I'd been living in. College was the first place where no one knew me as Savannah's older brother, and for a while that freedom tasted sweeter than anything. I threw myself into classes, projects, late-night study sessions, anything that could drown out the quiet ache of the home I'd left behind. I became one of the top students in my department, the kind professors remembered by name, but every time I called home hoping someone would be proud, the conversations always circled back to Savannah. My mother's first question was never about my grades or my life. It was always, "How's your sister? Did you remind her to sleep early? Did you tell her to eat before her shift?" My father wasn't any different. When I told him I'd been accepted into a competitive summer research program at Harvard, he didn't even pause to take it in. He just asked if my flight would conflict with Savannah's next dance performance. I didn't know how to explain to anyone what it felt like to succeed loudly in the world but quietly at home. In college, I was praised, recognized, pushed to grow. In my family, I was the background noise to Savannah's spotlight. It wasn't until years later, sitting at my grandmother's kitchen table in Denver, that her words finally named the truth I'd never dared to say out loud. She looked at me with that tired softness only she had and told me, "You weren't just overlooked, Riven. You were used. They built her dependence on the foundation of your sacrifice, and suddenly everything fell into place. Savannah's helplessness wasn't natural. It was planted, watered, and protected. She didn't ask to be dependent. They made her that way. And I didn't ask to be strong. They made me that way too." Growing up, every demand placed on me, every chore, every expectation that I handle it was shaping me into someone who could carry the weight they refused to put on her. In Portland, I became a data analyst. Numbers made sense to me in ways emotions never had. One night after rereading my grandmother's notebook, I opened a blank spreadsheet and started quantifying my childhood. 10 years worth of school events, activities, expenses. The results were brutal in their clarity. From ages 10 to 20, my parents had spent 8 times more on Savannah's hobbies and programs than on mine. They attended 31 of her events, but only 6 of mine. It wasn't a feeling anymore. It wasn't a memory warped by time. It was measurable, provable, undeniable. The more I dug, the heavier the weight became. And then something else surfaced, an odd memory I hadn't thought of in years. When I was 21, buried under the chaos of finals and internship applications, my grandfather had emailed me. I barely skimmed it at the time, too overwhelmed to pay attention. Now, standing in my temporary room in Denver, I opened my old inbox and found the message. The subject line was simple, almost gentle. For later. In the email he wrote, "There are things you won't understand until I'm no longer here." Attached was a file named Calder Legacy Protected PDF. But when I clicked on it, nothing happened. The file was gone. Deleted. And the login history showed a sign-in from an unfamiliar device during the week I was moving apartments in Portland. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. Who went into my account? Who deleted something my grandfather specifically wanted me to have? I knew the answer before I allowed myself to say it. Someone who didn't want me to see whatever he left behind. Someone who knew exactly what that file meant. As that realization sank in, the anxiety I'd fought since childhood returned like an old shadow stretching across the room. The question that closed around me like a fist was simple and terrifying. What had he been trying to protect me from, and who had taken it away? The next morning, I walked into Attorney Grady's office in downtown Denver with the rest of my extended family. The air smelled like disinfectant, cold and sharp, and every click of his pen against the legal pad made my shoulders tense. Sitting there, I couldn't shake the thought of that missing file. It lingered in the back of my mind like a warning I didn't yet know how to interpret. When the reading of the will began, the entire room shifted. My grandfather had divided his estate evenly among all his grandchildren. No favorites, no adjustments. Just fairness, the kind he had always shown, but my parents never had. Savannah and I were each set to receive just over $500,000. Hearing it out loud felt surreal. For the first time in my life, I wasn't standing in her shadow. But my parents' faces gave them away instantly. The tight jaw, the stiff posture, a smile that never reached their eyes. They weren't happy. They were calculating. After the reading, as everyone started to leave, my father grabbed my sleeve and steered me out to the back porch behind the office. His voice was low but firm, the same tone he used when he wanted to force agreement without appearing cruel. "Savannah needs the money more than you," he said. "She's struggling. You're stable. You have a job, a place to live. You should give your share to her." My mother stood slightly behind him, her voice trembling with practiced disappointment. A real man would take care of his family. Don't embarrass us by refusing. For the first time, I didn't fold. I told them no. The look they exchanged wasn't shock, it was offense. As if my claiming something that belonged to me was an act of betrayal. Then my father played the card he'd been hiding. He pulled out a folder and tapped it. "I'm one of the executors. I have authority to interpret my father's intentions. And I know he'd want Savannah protected." There was something cold in his eyes, something that told me he believed this wasn't manipulation, he believed it was his right. In that moment, standing with the Colorado sun hitting the back of my neck, I realized my parents weren't making a desperate request. They were executing a plan. I left without another word and returned to the small room where I was staying. My hands shook as I opened my laptop and went straight back to searching for the missing email. Again, nothing. The attachment was gone. The login from the unfamiliar device stared back like a fingerprint left at a crime scene. Someone had gone into my account during a moment of transition when I wasn't paying attention. It wasn't paranoia. It was too precise, too intentional. The only person who could give me answers was the one who had always told me the truth even when it hurt. So that night I drove to my grandmother Eleanor's house. She opened the door before I even knocked. Her eyes softened the moment she saw me, but behind them there was a sadness I hadn't noticed before. A knowing. "I've been waiting for you," she said quietly. "It's time you learned what your grandfather tried to shield you from." Her voice carried a gravity that made my heartbeat echo in my ears. And as I stepped inside, I understood this was the moment everything in my life had been leading toward, the moment where the past stopped whispering and finally spoke out loud. My grandmother led me down the narrow wooden stairs into the basement where my grandfather had spent most of his late years repairing old engines and organizing documents only he understood. The yellow bulbs flickered overhead, casting long shadows across toolboxes and metal shelves. The place smelled like motor oil and dust, the scent that had followed him everywhere. In the far corner stood a steel cabinet I'd seen my whole life but never thought twice about. She unlocked it slowly and whispered that he told her this drawer should only be opened after he was gone. My chest tightened. Inside lay a stack of documents wrapped in brown paper. When she placed them on the workbench and peeled the paper away, I felt myself step into a version of my family history I had never seen. The first item was an old draft of his will signatures, half faded. The second was a folder of emails and handwritten letters. Letters from my father to my grandfather asking him over and over again to change the will and move everything to Savannah. The language was forceful, desperate at times, manipulative. Then came the audio file. My grandmother pressed play, and my father's voice flooded the room raw and furious. He shouted that I didn't deserve anything, that I didn't love this family, and that everything should go to Savannah. My grandfather's reply was steady and heartbreaking. It's not that he doesn't love this family. This family has never loved him. Loved. Hearing those words shook something in me I had tried to keep buried. But that wasn't all. My grandmother explained that in the final version of his will, my grandfather included a specific clause meant to protect fairness. A no-contest provision stating that anyone who challenged the equal distribution would automatically lose their share. It was his way of shutting the door on the kind of manipulation my father was attempting. It meant that if my father tried to undermine the will, he'd only be hurting himself. Then she handed me another envelope, a document signed privately between my grandfather and Attorney Grady. It named a backup executor, someone my grandfather trusted in Santa Cruz. Not my father. My grandfather knew exactly who he was dealing with. And if my father ever tried to misuse his authority, the backup executor would immediately take over. It was a silent shield he'd built around me years before I even understood I needed protecting. When I asked about the missing email in my inbox, she didn't hesitate. She said she'd seen my father using my laptop the night my grandfather died. She hadn't confronted him then, thinking grief was making him restless. But now she realized he had been searching for anything that could disrupt his plan. "He was afraid of what Thomas left you," she said softly. Her voice trembled, not from fear but from anger she had held inside far too long. Then she pulled out a small wooden box filled with pieces of my childhood. Programs from plays my parents missed. A photocopy of the science award they barely noticed. Photos of me standing alone at school events, smiling in ways that looked brave but hollow. She had saved them to prove one day that I wasn't imagining a lifetime of imbalance. "I knew someone would one day make you doubt your own experiences," she said. "So I made sure you'd have proof." Standing there surrounded by my grandfather's tools and all the hidden truths they had fought to protect, I finally saw the full picture. This wasn't just a family dispute. It wasn't a disagreement over money. It was the continuation of a battle my grandparents had been fighting for decades to shield me from the very people meant to nurture me. My father's ambition, my mother's complicity, the fragile pedestal they built for Savannah, and me, the invisible one they expected to carry the weight of their choices. I realized I wasn't just defending an inheritance. I was defending a life my grandfather had tried so hard to preserve for me, and from that moment retreat was no longer an option. A week later, my grandmother called for a meeting at her house in Denver. She invited all of my father's siblings and their spouses, insisting it was time everyone heard the truth. When I walked into the living room, the atmosphere felt charged like the air before a storm breaks. I sat near the coffee table, aware that every gaze in the room carried curiosity, concern, or quiet dread. It felt exactly like a trial, and I was both witness and defendant. My grandmother didn't waste a second. She placed the folders and recordings on the table and told everyone to listen before speaking. One by one, she revealed everything: the letters my father sent, the recorded fight between him and my grandfather, her notes documenting years of favoritism, and even the proof of the unauthorized login to my email. Gasps moved across the room as the weight of each piece settled into place. My aunts and uncles stared at each other, stunned at the lengths my father had gone. My father reacted exactly as I feared. He jumped to his feet, shouting that I had manipulated my grandmother, that she was old and easily misled, that I had twisted things for my own gain. My mother chimed in through tears, accusing me of tearing the family apart for money. Their words were loud, sharp, echoing against the walls. Savannah hovered behind them, wringing her hands, her expression lost and fragile. But then something happened that silenced the entire room. Savannah stepped forward, her voice shaking, and said she saw my father using my laptop the night our grandfather died. She said it quietly, almost apologetically, but it hit the room like a brick. My father snapped toward her, shouting that she didn't understand what she saw, but the crack in Savannah's voice told everyone she did. She was beginning to see our parents clearly for the first time. At that moment, the front door opened and Attorney Grady walked in holding a sealed envelope. He announced that the backup executor, my grandfather's trusted friend, had officially activated his authority due to signs of misconduct. The room fell silent as Grady read the legal order removing my father from his role entirely. The color drained from his face. My mother clutched his arm, bewildered and terrified. The tension broke when Savannah collapsed into a chair, crying that she had never wanted any of this, that she never asked to be put on a pedestal that hurt me. She admitted she never realized how much had been taken from me so she could be protected from the world. Her words cracked open something inside the family, the first real fracture in the illusion my parents had built. My father swung around, pointing at me with shaking hands, declaring that I was no longer his son. My mother followed him toward the hallway, trying to pull Savannah with them, but Savannah tugged her arm free and stepped back toward me. The look in her eyes wasn't defiance. It was awakening. My parents stormed out, slamming the door behind them, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. My grandmother exhaled deeply, the sound full of sorrow, but also relief. The family stood there, absorbing the reality that had been hidden for so long. And as I looked around the room at the faces who finally understood the truth, at my sister standing beside me instead of behind them, I realized something that sent a chill through me. The inheritance was never the real wound. It was just the one deep enough to make everyone finally look. Everything else, the imbalance, the neglect, the engineered dependence, the years of swallowed pain had been there long before the will was ever written. And for the first time I understood that what had just happened wasn't an ending. It was the beginning of the real fight. A month after the confrontation in Denver, my aunt invited everyone to a gathering back in Redwood County, insisting that the family needed healing closure, or at least some attempt at peace. I wasn't sure I believed in any of that, but I went anyway, partly out of obligation, and partly because I wanted to stand on that soil without feeling like a shadow for once. My parents weren't invited, though everyone quietly feared they would show up regardless. Redwood County was their home turf, and people like them didn't walk away from control without one last swing. I stood in the backyard of my grandfather's old cabin, the towering redwoods rising behind the house like silent witnesses. Every corner of that yard carried a memory, some sharp, some dull, all heavy. I had my inheritance secured, but the victory felt hollow. My body felt wrung out, as if every part of me had been pulled in opposite directions for too long. I was exhausted in a way sleep couldn't fix. The legal storm had passed, but the emotional wreckage was still scattered everywhere inside me. Guests began to mingle, sharing food stories, awkward glances. And right when I thought the evening might pass without chaos, the sound of an engine ripped through the quiet. My father's old pickup skidded into the yard, gravel spraying. My mother stepped out of the passenger side carrying a taped-up box like it was evidence in a trial. No one greeted them. No one even pretended. My father scanned the crowd, jaw clenched, and declared loudly that if everyone wanted the truth, he was ready to give it. He launched into a speech so rehearsed it almost sounded theatrical. He accused me of plotting to steal Savannah's future, of manipulating my grandmother, of deceiving my grandfather before he died. He claimed that I had poisoned the family against him, that I had shamed them publicly, that my grandfather had been too old to understand what was happening. My mother, standing beside him with staged tears, added that I'd brought humiliation to the Calder name. The whole yard went silent. I felt dozens of eyes on me, waiting, weighing, wondering if any of what my parents were saying could be true. Then my mother hurled the taped box toward my feet. It split open on impact, spilling 20 years of family photo albums across the dirt. She screamed that everything she had kept was for me, that I had thrown away their love for money. Her voice cracked in a way that used to make me feel guilty, but now only made something inside me go still. Those albums had always been for Savannah. I had no place in those pages, she knew that. Everyone did. Before I could speak, another voice cut through the tension, trembling but clear. Savannah stepped forward. For the first time in her life, she didn't hide behind them. She said she had seen my father open my laptop the night our grandfather died. She said it quietly, almost apologetically, but the effect was instant. The space froze. My father spun toward her, shouting that she didn't understand anything, but she didn't back down. Her eyes were wide, but her voice didn't waver. She stood between me and our parents, as if finally choosing a side she'd spent her whole life avoiding. My aunt, standing near the porch, pulled a manila envelope from her coat. She said she had found it cleaning out my grandfather's study. Inside was a printed copy of the email my grandfather had sent me years ago, the one someone had tried to erase, along with a handwritten note addressed to Savannah. In that note, he wrote that he loved her, but he would never give her something that cost me harm. Savannah read it, her lips trembling. When she lowered the page, something inside her seemed to collapse. My father snapped. He shouted at me, calling me every name he'd stored for decades, and when he couldn't get a reaction, he shoved a heavy wooden table, sending glasses and plates crashing to the ground. One of my uncles restrained him, and even then he looked wild-eyed, furious, not at losing control, but at the truth finally being something he couldn't bury. I stepped forward and told the family everything I had held inside for 30 years, the favoritism, the neglect, the way I had always been expected to carry the burdens no one else wanted. I explained that I didn't want more than Savannah. I just wanted what was mine. I wanted fairness, dignity, some acknowledgement that I had mattered too. My voice trembled but didn't falter. For the first time, I spoke without fear of my parents interrupting or correcting me. My aunts and uncles pulled my parents away, trying to calm them. My mother sobbed into her hands. My father cursed the whole family and stormed off. Savannah sank into a chair, whispering an apology so soft it sounded like a confession or a release. When the sun dipped below the redwoods and the yard grew quiet, I stood there breathing in the damp evening air, realizing I wasn't the same person who once felt trapped in this place. I felt like someone who had finally broken through the shell that held him small for 3 decades. After the chaos in Redwood County, I stayed in Denver for a few days, needing time to gather myself before heading back to Portland. One afternoon, my grandmother asked me to sit with her by the window of her living room. She held a wooden box I hadn't seen before, and when she placed it in my hands, she said it was time I saw what my grandfather had left for me beyond the will. Inside the box was the scrapbook he'd made of my life, my certificates, my science fair ribbons, my college acceptance letters, even a program from the school play they'd missed. Each page felt like a quiet apology he had tried to give on behalf of the people who never looked closely enough. Beneath the scrapbook was a printed copy of the Calder Legacy file, the original version of the document he'd wanted me to have. He had written a note on the first page: "I want you to know you were never overlooked because you lacked value. You were overlooked because they couldn't see what I saw." I didn't try to stop the tears. My grandmother then told me something she had kept to herself for years. My father once pushed so hard to convince my grandfather to give everything to Savannah that the two of them stopped speaking for months. They only reconciled because my grandfather feared the conflict would hurt me. The fight over the will wasn't new, it started before I was even born. Hearing that, I understood that this battle had never been mine to begin with. I was just the one who finally refused to keep paying the price. The inheritance no longer felt like money. It felt like evidence that someone in this world had seen me clearly, fought for me quietly, and believed I deserved more than the scraps of attention I was given. I decided I wouldn't use the money to erase the past, but to reshape the future. I met with a financial advisor in Portland and developed a plan. Part of the inheritance would fund the Redwood Scholarship Fund for teenagers who grew up in households defined by emotional neglect. Another part would go toward opening a small counseling center where young adults could access help navigating the kind of wounds that take years to name. It felt like the first meaningful step toward giving someone else what I had needed all along. Savannah visited me a few days later, looking nervous and strangely older. She said she had lived her whole life in a delicate cage built by our parents, and she didn't want to be the reason I suffered anymore. She told me she planned to move out, attend community college, and start taking responsibility for herself, instead of relying on the pedestal she never asked for. She apologized not just for the fight, but for the years she hadn't noticed or questioned the imbalance. For the first time, I saw her as her own person, not the symbol our parents had turned her into. My mother reached out next, this time quietly. She asked my grandmother for the number of a family therapist and sent me a long message admitting she had been wrong. My grandmother told me I didn't have to forgive immediately, just give her room to learn. My father, meanwhile, stayed silent except for an email threatening to sell our childhood home if we didn't come to our senses. but even that didn't shake me the way it once would have. I was no longer carrying a guilt that didn't belong to me. When I returned to Portland, I found myself surrounded by the people who had supported me. My friends, my grandmother's side of the family, and Savannah, who called every few days to share small victories. I stood in my apartment looking at the scrapbook, the documents, the memories of what my grandfather had fought so hard to protect, and realized the real inheritance was never money. It was freedom. Freedom from a story I didn't write, from a role I didn't choose, from a cycle I didn't want to continue. I thought about the boy who once stood alone in the yard watching the redwoods swallow the evening light. I whispered to him that he made it out. I whispered that he was no longer invisible. Before I unpacked, I sent Savannah an email. "If you ever need me, I'm here. But this is your beginning. Make it yours." And then I closed my laptop and stood still, feeling something I hadn't felt in 30 years, lightness. My journey didn't end by exposing what my parents did. It ended by reclaiming who I was always meant to be. There's something strange about healing. You never notice the exact moment it happens. It doesn't come with fireworks or a clean break. It arrives quietly, like a breath you didn't know you'd been holding finally slipping out of your chest. Looking back on everything, the favoritism, the silence, the years spent trying to earn a kind of love that was never meant for me, I realized the hardest part was never losing a family. It was learning that sometimes the family you're born into isn't the one that gets to define your worth. What saved me wasn't money or documents or even justice. It was the simple truth that someone once saw me clearly and believed I deserved better. My grandfather didn't just leave me an inheritance. He left me a lesson that we're allowed to choose peace even when we weren't raised with it. We're allowed to walk away from the people who can't love us right and still wish them healing from afar. And maybe that's the heart of this whole story. That no matter how messy your past is, no matter who failed you, you're still allowed to build something softer, something kinder, something that finally feels like home. You're allowed to break the cycle. You're allowed to be your own beginning. And if no one along the way has told you this, you deserve a life that doesn't hurt to live. You deserve mornings that don't feel heavy, nights that don't echo with old wounds, and days where you don't have to shrink yourself to fit inside someone else's version of love. Healing isn't about forgetting what happened. It's about choosing what comes next. It's about understanding that being treated unfairly doesn't make you unworthy, and that surviving something painful doesn't mean you have to carry it forever. Some of us grow up learning to tiptoe around the people who were supposed to protect us. Some of us learn to apologize for taking up space. Some of us learn to hide our joy so it doesn't offend the wrong person. But we can unlearn those things. We can rewrite the story. We can start again slowly, quietly, bravely. If my story made you pause even for a moment, if it reminded you of a part of your own journey or a hurt you've carried quietly, I'd love to know you're here. Tell me where you're watching from. Is it early morning where you are, or is the night settling in? I always wonder what the weather feels like on the other side of these words. Sometimes knowing someone out there is listening makes all the difference. Sometimes just saying I'm here is enough to make a stranger feel less alone. And if you want to stay with me for the next chapter, consider subscribing. It supports me more than you know, and it keeps this little corner of honesty and healing alive. A place where stories aren't just told, but felt. A place where people who've been overlooked, underestimated, or forgotten finally get to breathe. Thank you for being here. Truly. Some stories are heavy to carry alone, and tonight, you helped lighten mine.